To introduce that panel, I am delighted to introduce a person who will be familiar to many of you, Professor Gareth Williams. Professor Williams is the Violin Family Professor of Classics at Columbia. He is also a former chair of Literature Humanities and one of its most eminent instructors. So I am just delighted to have him introduce the panel. Professor Williams.
Thank you, Roosevelt. Welcome, everyone. It's a wonderful privilege to be here today. I want to be extremely brief in just laying out a couple of points about what is going on today and the raison d'etre for it. Literature humanities, as you all know, is fundamentally an exercise in some sense in translation. I speak as a professor of classics, and in the first semester, as you know, you cover the text from the 5th century, from Homer to the 5th century Greece, down to the Bible, and then in the second semester at the start, in January, Virgil and Ovid. Ovid and Virgil are very conscious of the heritage that they inherit from the past and of the issues of translation that are tied up with thinking about the Greek language and its transition into a highly Hellenized Latin format. Throughout the 2 semesters of Lit Hum, until we get to King Lear in the second semester, everything we read is effectively an exercise in translation. And with my students, very often the task does arise of trying to explain what goes on in the difference, the separation between the text that we read in the classroom in the first semester and the Greek originals. And in that respect, part of the function of today's panel is precisely to bring to the surface a problem, a challenge, a question about literature humanities that is fundamental to everything we do down to King Lear. That is why I so look forward to the conversation today, thinking through and thinking about the complexities of the translation exercise and what actually happens to the experience of reading when we read a Montaigne, we read a Dostoevsky, we read a Cervantes in a language different from that in which the works were originally written. What is that experience like? What do we gain from that experience? And what perhaps might we lose from that experience? I hope those questions and many others will surface throughout the proceedings this morning. Thank you. And I just want to introduce in that respect Professor Susan Bernofsky, the Director of Literary Translation at Columbia, who will actually introduce the individual panelists. Thank you.
We can't see you, and we also couldn't hear the introductions that happened before, so I'm not sure if you know who I am. Have I been introduced? Say yes or no. Okay, then I don't have to introduce myself. I am just going to let you know what's happening here. I'm Susan Bernofsky, obviously, and we have a wonderful, wonderful panel of speakers who I will be introducing at greater length in a moment. I want to say a couple of opening remarks about what we're doing here. Specifically, why do we retranslate the classics? And then I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time. And I've asked each of them to prepare a brief statement of 5 to 7 minutes about their work. And then I'm going to quiz them with really hard questions that I hope catch them unawares, but probably won't. And then in the end, the floor will be opened up to you, and you can pose questions to our speakers as well. So the question of why do we retranslate the classics? All of you have been reading some classic works, I know, on your syllabus for Lit Hum, although we decided backstage that it should be called Lit Hume, and then we decided it might be worrisome that people would think that all that was read was David Hume, which I think is not the case. Therefore, Lit Hum, I know you've been reading a lot of classic works, and you've been reading them in translations that were selected for you by the instructors who put together the course, who looked carefully at the translations and chose the ones they thought would be best for you. Have any of you tried looking at competing translations of one work? I can't even really see hands very well. Yeah, some of you have, and I see some waving hands. Excellent, thank you. The stage lights are quite powerful here. So those of you who've done that know how different a work can become in different translations, radically different, shockingly different if you've never considered that fact. And so why do we keep retranslating the classics? You know, there's a conventional wisdom about it that classics don't age, but translations do. We can talk about that. It's a controversial notion. On the other hand, Shakespeare, you know, we don't really think of him as aging, although we do read his work in adaptations in modernized English to make it easier for us. I know I've translated Hermann Hesse's novel Siddhartha, which is read a lot by young people in the United States in English, and I was surprised to learn that it is not read these days by young people in Germany. The reason I was given for this was, oh, the language seems much too old, it's old-fashioned, it seems like a book my grandma would have read. And that's interesting. So the English translations have made the book more accessible to young people in the country. That's interesting. What makes a book a classic? It's not just popularity at the time, although popularity at the time can be important. Think about Goethe's 1774 novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, also translated as The Sufferings of Young Werther. It was an international bestseller. It spawned international crazes, including, believe it or not, a suicide craze. It's a novel about a young man who winds up killing himself, and people were reading the book and killing themselves around the world as an incredible craze. It's still a classic. On the other hand, Goethe was not the most read writer of his day. Although he ran a theater in Weimar, the person whose plays were put on most at the time was a fellow named August von Kotzebue. I don't know if any of you have heard of him. I actually did see a play of his performed once in Germany, and it was kind of like the early 19th century equivalent of the Jackass movies, which probably will not prove to have been great classic works, although I could be wrong. Different ages make different decisions. Now, retranslating the classics can have to do with questions of publishing. For example, you're a publishing house. A classic work is probably old enough that it's out of copyright, which means that you don't have to purchase international copyrights to publish it. At that point, it becomes financially kind of feasible to have your own translation done. And it's also a prestige item. One of the reasons that we have multiple translations of certain key works is that every publishing house wants to have one. That's interesting. It means that we have a lot of multiple translations of certain works and, very few or one or no translations of lots of newer works. There's a scholarly point of view to retranslations. Often there will be a scholarly edition in the original language, a better manuscript available, new insights about the original that can be brought to bear on a new translation. So scholarly reasons motivate the retranslation. Oh, by the way, for those of you who do retranslation, Inventory Magazine, which is published out of Princeton by graduate students, has a call for submissions for an edition of their magazine that will be all retranslations. And if you wish to submit to them, Google Inventory Magazine or write to invent at Princeton EDU. They asked me to make a plug. That's the plug. One more thing about classic works. Very often the works that become classics are books of particular beauty. And so generation after generation of translator comes in and thinks, the translations aren't quite right yet. I want to get it right. I think I can get it righter than this last one. And, I think that will continue on because, perfection is something that in translation we aspire to more than perhaps absolutely achieve. As a retranslator of Kafka, I looked at the old translations, which I admire a great deal, and also thought, you can't quite tell how funny Kafka is from these translations, and I want the humor to be more foregrounded. And so when I sat down to retranslate him, I was thinking about that. So questions of tone, style, voice, all these things play into a decision to retranslate. And really it's true that there is no greater test of a translator's skill than to retranslate a classic work. On that note, I'm going to introduce the first of our masters sitting on this panel, namely Edith Grossman, who's sitting at the far end, who is a translator, critic, and occasional teacher of literature in Spanish. She was born in Philadelphia, attended the University of Pennsylvania and the University of California at Berkeley, completed a PhD at New York University, and has been the recipient of awards and honors including the Fulbright, Woodrow Wilson, and Guggenheim Fellowships, the Penn Ralph Manheim Medal for Translation, an award in literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, the Queen Sophia Translation Prize, and induction into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's brought over into English poetry, fiction, and nonfiction by major Latin American writers, including, get ready for this list, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Carlos Fuentes, Mario Vargas Llosa, Alvaro Mutis, and Mayra Montero. There's more. Peninsular works that she has translated include Don Quixote, as you know, novels by Julian Rios, Carmen Laforet, Carlos Rojas, and Antonio Munoz Molina, poetry of the 16th and 17th centuries, which I'm likely to ask her about later, and the solitudes of Luis de Góngora. She lives in Manhattan, and his two sons, both of whom are musicians. So Edie, I want to hear from you, and then I'll introduce the others before they speak.
Oh, you want me to say that again?
I would like for you to tell us what you have to tell us about translation. I'm going to introduce everybody else just before they speak, otherwise we'll overwhelm the crowd with information.
Okay. I wanted to talk to you a little bit anecdotally about taking on the impossible task of translating Don Quixote, which to my mind, is probably the greatest novel ever written, and by a man who invented the genre of the novel and created a language, a literary language for Spanish that has never been equaled and is inescapable. Everybody who writes in Spanish has Cervantes in the back of her or his mind. There is no way around it, and there is nobody in English that I can think of who occupies that space, that mental space. Shakespeare is certainly there, but not in prose. The King James Version of the Bible is certainly there, but that's a very specialized language. So Cervantes is a huge, huge figure. I undertook this because the publisher called me, Dan Halpern from Echo Press, called and said, would you be interested in translating Don Quixote? I said, I think you have the wrong Grossman. I said, I do Latin American, modern Latin American writers. He said, I know what you do. Are you interested in translating this book? I said, absolutely. And I hung up the phone, and I said, oh, God, what have I done? Why did I ever agree to do this? So there was a good amount of thinking required before I even started the translation. And I think this must come up with anyone, for anyone who translates older literature. After all, Quixote was published in 1605 and 1615, so it means there's 400 years between us and it. So the first question is, do I have to make believe I'm an Elizabethan? Do I have to write what I think 17th century English sounded like? And I thought about it a long time, because clearly, although Spanish has not changed as much in 400 years as English has, English is a very radical language in terms of changes and absorbing words and structures from other languages. The Spanish of Cervantes is not the Spanish of today. And I was worrying about this, thinking about it, and finding it very difficult to come to a decision. And I happened to write to one of the authors I translated, Julian Rios, and to send him New Year's greetings and to tell him that I was going to undertake the Quixote and how terrified I was, how happy and scared I was at exactly the same time. He said, don't worry about it. He said, don't worry about it. You translate Cervantes just the way you translate everybody else. He's the best of us, and don't worry about it. I said, all right, I won't worry. The reaction I really loved was Garcia Marquez's. I had to talk to him about another matter, and he said, so I hear you're two-timing me with Cervantes. And it was such a funny remark that I can't even remember what I answered him. In any event, I finally decided not to use some invented, quaint language, not only because I'm incapable of it, but because Cervantes was not writing anything quaint. He was pushing an envelope so hard in the creation of a flexible and powerful language for fiction that I felt that I had to do my best to make an English that was somehow comparable to that. What I did decide to do was to have no slang at all. The narrative voice would be a fairly straightforward, high-level, high-diction voice. And then the voices had to change because there are characters in the novel, as you probably know, who are illiterate, and their level of speech is different from the speech of other characters in the book. The other question that haunted me was the question of this question: was I responsible for reading every translation of Quixote that had ever been published? Every translation into English. Now, I had read the Quixote many times, I think at least 10 times, because in my former life I was a teacher. And I was a student long before I was a teacher. And in the course of undergraduate and graduate school, I read Quixote multiple times, and then I taught it. But it was always in Spanish. I read one translation. The first time I read the book, I was a kid, I was a teenager, and I read Samuel Putnam's translation that I think was published in 1955 or sometime like that. Subsequently, I had never read any translation of the book, and I decided not to. I decided that I wanted to keep my ear clear. I wanted to be able to try to hear Cervantes' voice without any intermediaries. That worked out fairly well, I thought, because Cervantes' voice is unique. And it resounded in my ear. Now, it took me 2 years to do the book. Between part 1 and part 2, I translated a short erotic novel, which kind of revved me up and got me ready for part 2. And after the first year, and the part 1 took roughly a year. And then I thought, I can look at some translations, other translations. My sons, when they left home, had left various books behind in my bookcases, and there were a couple of editions of Quixote that they had read in school. And I thought, okay, I have the sound now, I have the voice now, and I can use those translations as dictionaries. In other words, when I could not figure out the meaning of a word, I would see how somebody else translated it. Well, don't you know that they never agreed with each other? So I had to figure out the translation on my own in any event. So this is unlike what Lydia Davis does. Lydia Davis, I understand, when she translated Madame Bovary, after she had her rough draft, she read every translation in English. I've never done that subsequently when I've translated older works, and I have. After taking the plunge with Don Quixote, I have translated other 16th and 17th century writers, and I kind of enjoy it. I love the way they wrote back in the day. So that, in brief, is how and why I translated the Quixote. If I had it to do all over again, I absolutely would. I had fun translating that book. When I was a kid, the first time I read it, I thought it was the saddest book I had ever read, and it would move me to tears. Over the years, you know, your skin develop a kind of armor around your heart. And the older I got, the funnier I found it. And when I was working on it, I was laughing out loud at the computer. I was working on it and saying, I can't believe what this man just said. And one of the glories of Cervantes is that I think I was right both times. It is the saddest book I've ever read, and it is the funniest book I've ever read. And I'm really happy that you folks are reading it, or have read it, are reading it, or will read it at some point. Thanks very much.
So next I'm going to introduce a pair of speakers who are sitting in the middle of the podium, Richard Pevear and Larissa Volokhonsky. Let me tell you a bit about them. Richard Pevear was born in Boston, grew up on Long Island, attended Allegheny College and the University of Virginia. After a stint as a college teacher, he moved to the Maine coast and eventually to New York City, where he worked as a freelance writer, editor, and translator, and also as a cabinet maker. He has published 2 collections of poetry, many essays and reviews, and some 30 books translated from French, Italian, and Russian. Larissa Volokhonsky was born in Leningrad, attended Leningrad State University, and on graduating joined a scientific team, I'm loving these bios, whose work took her to the far east of Russia, to Kamchatka and Sakhalin Island. She emigrated to Israel in 1973 and to the US in 1975, where she attended Yale Divinity School and St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary. Oh, St. Vladimir's, probably. Soon after settling in New York City, she was married to Richard Pevear, whom we see here, and a few years later they moved to France with their 2 children. Together, Pevear and Volokhonsky have translated 20 books from the Russian, including works by Fyodor Dostoevsky, Leo Tolstoy, Mikhail Bulgakov, Nikolai Gogol, Anton Chekhov, Boris Pasternak, and Nikolai Leskov. Their translation of Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov received the PEN Translation Prize for 1991. Their translation of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina was awarded the same prize in 2002. And in 2006, they were awarded the first Efim Etkind International Translation Prize by the European University of St. Petersburg. Most recently, they have been collaborating with playwright Richard Nelson on translations of Russian plays, Turgenev's A Month in the Country, Gogol's Inspector, and Chekhov's Cherry Orchard. I'm so glad you all could join us all the way from Paris.
Thank you very much. I don't know if we should speak simultaneously.
Never. I always
should translate
speak
each other.
simultaneously.
Yes, thank you for having us. It's very good to be here. I've never been in this theater, but I once taught at this university. We were told that the topic of this panel would be the retranslation of classics. It's a question that people very often ask. Well, for instance, they will say, hasn't that been translated? And I will say, yes, 10 times. Then why are we doing another one? There are several reasons. Edith touched on some of the more important ones, which is the distance in time and the revoicing, recovery, rediscovery of an older book. Another one is one that Lydia Davis actually talked a bit about, which is, I don't remember quite the term she used, but she talked about the sort of itch to translate. You read something and you say, I wonder how I could do that in English, and you just start trying to do it. And I think I began very early in my life, when I was 17, as a translator, just for myself, for the desk drawer. With that same question, I would read a poem, and I would say, I wonder how that would go into English. Usually they didn't go, but that's why they stayed in the desk drawer. But the task itself is sort of it's not a formulated theoretical thing. It's an innate gut reaction. I want to try to do that. In the case of our work with Dostoevsky, there was also a much more specific reason. We've talked about this, I think, before. Maybe you've heard it, but we began translating because I didn't know Russian at the time that we were married. We had tried some translating together, which didn't work. The poetry was too difficult. But I decided to reread the Brothers Karamazov. I took a translation. Larissa got very curious. I wonder how he does that. She started reading the Russian. And she was reading the Russian. She would, even just the opening, the little preface called From the Author, she would come running to me and say, how did he translate that? And she'd look and say, he didn't. And this happened a number of times, and this turned on a light in my head. I said, wait, what is it that's missing, and how much is missing? And she said, but the whole thing is very funny, and this isn't funny at all. And then a bigger light went on in my head. I thought, Dostoevsky's funny. Because English readers have this idea that he's a dark, brooding, helpless, volcanic sort of outpouring. He's not a very good writer. This is very often said. He didn't write very well, but his ideas were interesting. In fact, the opposite is true. His ideas were often rather disappointingly limited, but his writing is incredible. And what's mainly incredible about it, what's powerful in it, is his playfulness. And this is a quality that had been removed from translation.
It's the same as Don Quixote.
And you see it just, he introduces his narrator from the author, who is not the author. It's not Dostoevsky. It's a local guy who's writing a local chronicle about somebody he knew. And he flounders around. He also plays. He has his own way of playing, sometimes very poorly. He makes bad jokes. He fumbles for words. He trips over himself. I can give you some examples, like why am I writing this biography of Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov? To me, he is noteworthy, but I decidedly doubt that I shall succeed in proving it to the reader. That sort of phrase, I decidedly doubt. The thing is that he does perhaps make a figure, but a figure of an indefinite, indeterminate sort. One thing, perhaps, is rather doubtless. He is a strange man. And so on. He goes on. Then he talks about the odd man. He says, for not only is an odd man not always a particular and isolated case, but on the contrary, it sometimes happens it is precisely he, perhaps, who bears within himself the heart of the whole, while the other people of his epoch have all, for some reason, been torn away from it for a time by some kind of flooding wind. This quite elaborate rhetoric, which falls rather flat. He says he winds up with a contradiction, and then he says, being at a loss to resolve these questions, I am resolved to leave them without any resolution.
That's a good pun.
And he thinks it's funny, and it is funny in another way. I mean, we find it funny, not quite for the same reason that he does. But anyway, all of that sort of voicing, and I began thinking about that, and in all the characters of the novel, but there is no authoritative voice, and this is what Dostoevsky wanted to remove from his novel. There is no voice that has authority. There's no Tolstoy who just tells you, this is what happened. You know, this is how you should think about it. Everything is up in the air, and as a result, the characters become more real because they're not controlled by the author for some ideological reason. And it winds up as a comedy in the sense that Dante is a divine comedy. And I would mean that very seriously, if I can say that. that the humor finally shows the incompleteness of human fate on Earth. Nothing is resolved. It can't be resolved. And the humor of the style is part of that irresolution which points to a higher resolution outside the bounds of the novel. All of Dostoevsky's books, as you may have noticed, or may notice, or will notice, end with a future that's just beginning. I think you're all reading The Crime and Punishment. Well, I don't want to spoil it for you, but at the very end he says, well, but that's another novel, and leaves the fate of Raskolnikov up in the air. And the comedy of the writing is part of that, is an essential part of it, which had been missed by earlier translators, so that we hoped to restore that, the whole dimension of the book. To which my wife will add the necessary correction.
Well, Richard already said everything I think, so that there isn't much for me left. I could only add that when I discovered this, this really missing dimension of Dostoevsky's prose in the existing translations, not that we read many. In fact, if I read other translations, I would never have undertaken to do ours, because each time I read someone else's translation, I think, it's very good. I couldn't. What could I do here? And then I look at in the original and I start working, and it always comes out differently. And I don't know why. I don't know why. It's simply because we do pick in other. We don't compare them. We don't read all of them, but we usually have some other translation or two on our desk when we work, and we sort of check on it at the end when we already have our version ready, what we think our almost final version, and it just comes out differently, except when there is something absolutely straightforward and simple. They're amazing. I could go on giving all kinds of examples, and it is incomprehensible to me, because very often, for some reason, translators just don't translate what's written. There is for instance, Dostoevsky says filched. Filched. He uses a slightly slangy word for steal. Everybody says he stole. Filched is different. And it's not isolated. Or for instance, there is this rule. I don't know who invented this rule. I hear it was Flaubert who said that you cannot repeat. You cannot repeat the same word within a page or within a paragraph.
On the same page or something.
Same page. Now, it's absolutely necessary to repeat sometimes. There is a great scene in the Brothers Karamazov, the scene in the court, when Alyosha all of a sudden starts repeating the word precisely. He beats himself on his chest and he says, and this is precisely at that moment that I noticed that he precisely beat himself on the chest, precisely then that I thought precisely. He repeats the word precisely 15 times on the same page. And Mitya, who meanwhile sits in the dock and listens, all of a sudden jumps up and says, precisely, Alyosha. And it sort of resolves, releases all this incredible tension. Now, if a translator strives to replace each of these 15 precisely's with a synonym, he's in trouble, really.
There aren't 15.
There aren't. So there are things like that, or there is a moment of very great tension when a little boy, Ilyusha, is dying, and his father is the only son, and he's 12, I don't remember. His father is heartbroken, and they're all his school friends are around his bed, and then invited at great expense, someone invited for them a doctor from Moscow who comes to examine him, and they will wait for the doctor's verdict, and the doctor comes out of Ilyusha's room, and the father says, so tell us, what is it? Is it soon? He asks, actually asking whether his son is going to die soon. And the doctor says, be prepared for anything, said the doctor, and himself prepared to step through the door, or something like that. It seems like a minor thing, but it's a moment of great tension which is somehow heightened by this really silly repetition. And if there are 3, 4, 5 moments like that on a page, if you don't follow Dostoevsky in what he says, the reader will read a different novel.
Okay. So there.
All right. So no, it's also what Edith just said. You know, this wonderful thing. Just Don Quixote stands at the beginning of the tradition of a novel, and Dostoevsky is more or less at the peak. But there is the same thing of tragedy and comedy together. The same thing that we just heard about in much better than I am doing now.
Thank you so much. If everything were going to happen really symmetrically now, I would now be introducing J.M. Cohen, who translated the Montaigne translation that you all are reading. But since he has not been with us since 1989, that is not going to happen. He translated a lot of European literature over many years, including Cervantes, including Don Quixote,
Yes.
including Pasternak, and obviously including Montaigne. However, yes, we're not going to tilt tables. Instead, we brought you a real, live, living, healthy, eloquent translator, Wyatt Mason, who is also a translator of Montaigne and is going to speak to you about that. Bio note. Wyatt Mason is a critic, journalist, and translator. Modern Library published his 2-volume translation of the complete works of Arthur Rimbaud, a new edition of which he's preparing. He's translated contemporary French writers, Éric Chevillard, who I like a lot, for Archipelago, and Pierre Michon for Yale, and his translations of Montaigne's essays have appeared in 3 Penny Review. His criticism, which has won a National Magazine Award and a citation from the National Book Critics Circle, appears in the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, and the New Yorker. He is a contributing editor of Harper's, a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine, and is a senior fellow of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, and is here also, among other things, to show us that translators are not Luddites.
The bar has been set high. I would like to thank the organizers of this splendid event, and not least of which it gives me the opportunity to rub elbows with some of the people I admire most in the field and have for a very long time. I would also like to thank NyQuil, DayQuil, Alka-Seltzer Cold, and a special shout out to vitamins B and C. What is translation? On a platter, a poet's pale and glaring head, a parrot's screech, a monkey's chatter, and profanation of the dead. Reflected words can only shiver like elongated lights that twist in the dark mirror of a river between the city and the mist. That is translation. A poet's patience, and a scholar's passion blent. To what end but dove droppings on a monument? An abridged version, those rhyming lines of Vladimir Vladimirovich Nabokov's introductory remarks in his translation, 4 volumes of Eugene Onegin. Incidentally, of his 17 novels, he worked 8 years of his life on his translation of Eugene Onegin, whereas no novel took him more than 4. So in many ways, it's his great work. It's also his most reviled for the choices he made. Next. He had very strong opinions about translation. This is his teaching copy of Anna Karenina. He taught in American colleges for 20 years before Lolita allowed him to retire. And as was said about the repetition of words, in the first paragraph of Anna Karenina, which he says should be translated Anna Karenin, the word house, or some version of the word house, is used by Tolstoy in the Russian 8 times, he says, whereas this translator has changed half of them. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that at the very top of this, he has said, a complete disaster, this translation, which is perhaps even worse than the translation of the Bovary, which I corrected, but I have no time to do it to this one. So the idea that a great work of literature should find a great translator is a marvelous one, but it sometimes doesn't happen, and we have to make do with what we have. We often manage to allow a writer to find a reputation in a distant language, and it is a kind of magic, but it has a practical side. If in my case I've been trying to bring Montaigne into English, there certainly is no need for another translation in the sense that there are a great many and many fine ones, but they all aspire to offer very different Montaignes. And Montaigne, those first years who are here, have you already read some essays by him? You have, all right. So in attempting to render into English the writer who gave us the form of making an attempt at talking about a subject, the essay, a try. Montaigne from Bordeaux spent his time next in his last third of his life preparing his 107 essays in his small, uncomfortable house. The bottom left-hand corner was his personal library next, where it is said he was the last man to have every book. The proliferation of the printing press had only recently begun, and he was very wealthy and had everything and read everything, literally. Next. And here is the interior where he composed his essays, and so the transmission from there to here, from his space to our space, is one that one attempts. So if we go to the next slide. The first translation into English was by John Florio, an Italian. And it's a beautiful, wonderful read, and we will look at a few examples of it next. You'll note that it says done into English. I think that's a wonderful way of putting it. Moving on. Next. So here we'll take a look at, in Book 3, there's a wonderful essay of Montaigne's called Des Boiteux, which has been translated variously as On the Lame, Of Cripples, On Cripples, Cripples, etc. Spoiler alert, it's about having sex with cripples. Cripple here is defined by a person who has one leg shorter than the other. So if we look at the first line in French, next. And I will attempt not to throw out my back, so I'm going to do this. Il y a 2-3 ans qu'on accourcit l'an de 10 jours en France. The John Florio translation, next, offers 2 or 3 years are now past since the year hath been shortened to 10 days in France. There was also, and if we're going to leap forward in the 20th century, a Columbia professor named Donald Frame who prepared a superb, complete edition of the essays, and his first line begins, "It is 2 or 3 years since they shortened the year by 10 days in France." In the 90s, a British complete version of the essays appeared, translated by an Oxford deacon named M.A. Screech. Unfortunate name. In France, some 2 or 3 years ago now, they shortened the year by 10 days. So we have these seemingly similar, seemingly faithful, seemingly interchangeable or not translations. So let's look at how these stack up on the next slide. These spaces are only to make a point in the next line. So if we look first at the Florio, we'll see that the first clause, il y a 2 ou 3 ans, you can go forward one. 2 or 3 years are now past. He has changed the syntax, the structure of the syntax, so that 2 and 3 are at the beginning of the sentence. They are the subject. And then since, and then accourci, which he translates as hath been shortened, 10 days in France. It seems like a fairly literal translation. It seems like a fairly faithful translation. If we move on to the Donald frame, it is 2 or 3 years since they shortened the year by 10 days in France, and we put it next to Montaigne's in the next move. One more. We'll see that it is more than just a little bit faithful. It is actually word by word a translation which preserves the syntax of the French, so that it is even more literal as a translation than the first by Florio. And if we now look at the Screech, we will see that he has done something radical in that rather than keep maintaining the syntax in French, he has inverted. And France is now a prepositional phrase at the beginning, and 2 or 3 years has become some 2 or 3 years, modified with that partitive. And then we also see that he adds a now at the end to give a kind of conversational fluidity to the execution of that line. My reading in French of Montaigne is of a writer who does have a remarkably approachable conversational quality. Earlier spelling aside, the language in which Montaigne writes that I hear is one that is earthy, direct, conversational, unpretentious, learned, but not fussy. And so I think that Screech and Frame offer us 2 very different ideas of the poles of translation, from the literal to the liberal, the attempt to preserve in such a faithful manner a translation of the original, such that even the syntax of the original language is carried over, as Frames does, whereas Screech is attempting to translate into a colloquial English that might be the equivalent of the colloquial French of the 16th century. So what is a new translator left to do? My sense is that there is a middle road between these 2 routes of literality and liberality. And my issue with the Screech, which I admire very much, as a colloquial translation, is that Mr. Screech is an eminent scholar who's also an Oxford deacon, and he's translating into the idiomatic English of an Oxford deacon, which is spoken, I think, by 9 or 10 people. And one of the things I find in his translation consistently is not any want of fidelity, but a sound that doesn't sound like Montaigne's to me. So in this very simple sentence, my version, "2 or 3 years ago, the French year was shortened by 10 days. I, with Screech, like the idea of moving France to a different part in the sentence. And my imperative here is to try very hard to make an English as natural as the French seems natural to me. If we look briefly at one more sentence on the next page, we see that these simple sentences and their relatively simple solutions, which are not controversial, become more complicated. Because Montaigne typically has an alternation in his language between long, syntactically complex sentences, such as this one, and the short one that I showed you on the previous slide. And if we load the other versions here, and I won't talk about them in detail because we'll have a more lively conversation without it. I'll just bring your attention to one aspect of it. You will see that in all the versions here, there is a desire to, in all the versions here, the frame maintains his desire to almost syntactical fidelity, clause by clause. Within the clauses, a similar syntax to the syntax of the French, whereas Screech maintains a desire to go for a colloquial English. But if you look at that very last part of the sentence, in French, it's « Et vont calfeutrant cet endroit de quelques pièces fausses ». Florio gives us go about with some false patch to botch up those places. Frame says go and calf that place with some false patch. And then Screech says they then stop up the chinks with some false piece of oakum. And I can't help but reading that last one well, first thing to say is I have no idea what is being said in any of these versions. The second thing is that when I read the Screech, I read it this way. They then stop up the chinks with some false piece of oakum. It has this very fussy kind of... So in attempting a translation, the first thing I would do is try to make sure I understand what the French means. And actually in this modern age, it's wonderful to have a thing like the internet, because when you punch in calfeutré into Google Images, you actually get 500 images of what it is. And it means to caulk, such that you actually would caulk a gap in something. And so all the pictures that we get are there. It's also in dictionaries from the 17th and 18th century that you can use online that make clear that caulk would be an acceptable idea. There's an overwhelming metaphor that Montaigne is using here of liquid and it being contained, initially swallowed, and then a story doesn't essentially hold together, and then there's a potential for leakage. And so in mine, I tried to find an alternative. This is actually, if we go to the next one, this is actually, I did this last night. I've translated this phrase 1,000 times, and since the book hasn't, come together yet, I can continue to. I had an off we go to caulk the cracks with whatever will stop the leak. Now, that is about as liberal as you can get with staying within Montaigne's choices in terms of the images involved in this sentence. But it is much more radical as a choice than Frame's or Florio's, but I also think it's comprehensible, which I think is important because it turns out Montaigne wasn't being opaque. Between literality and liberality is basically the idea that I try to come to an understanding of when I translate. Thank you.
Bravo. If we stopped the event now, you would have heard plenty of wonderful things about translation. So this is the part that in New Orleans we call lagniappe. It's something extra thrown in for free. Extra questions. I came in with a whole list of things I wanted to ask, but now after hearing the talks, for which thank you so much, these were all four of you were so interesting. Now I wanted to ask other things. And since Larissa and Wyatt both spoke to this issue of, what fidelity in translation really is, I want to throw that on the table. This is a huge catchword, as I'm sure most, if not all of you know. What is literalness in translation? What is fidelity? What does that concept even mean? Edie, I want to start with you.
Well, I'm laughing because...
That's why I'm starting with you.
Yes, okay. There's a lovely cartoon that has a very bewildered translator and a very unhappy author. And the caption reads, "Do you not be happy with me as the translator of the books of you?" And that's what I think of literalism, and that's sort of what I think of fidelity as well. We live a schizophrenic life because, we translators, because our loyalty goes in two different directions, and one is to the original language and the other is to the language we translate into. And if it doesn't work in English, then it's a bad translation. If it doesn't read the way the original reads, in other words, if it isn't fluid, if the original is fluid, if it isn't funny, if it isn't plain spoken, whatever the characteristic of the original may be, if that doesn't exist in English, then it's a bad translation. The metaphor I have always used is that you don't do translations with tracing paper. You are rewriting a book or an essay or a poem in another language. And the original is the starting point, and there's great loyalty to what is being said. But you cannot be loyal to how it is said because the two languages are entirely different. So that's my fast response to fidelity and literalism.
Any arguments against for?
Yeah, I would just add that there's very common terminology now in translation, talking about translation, of domestication and foreignizing. Mm-hmm. And I've always been puzzled by that, whether when we work, are we foreignizers or domesticators? And we're often put in the lump of foreignizers, but I think it's a quite false dichotomy because I always feel that I'm both. I'm doing both at the same time. If I just foreignize, I'll produce what Edith quoted there. But if I make a point of simply domesticating everything into how we say it in English, I lose what's unique in the original. And it occurred to me once that every great writer is an event in the language he's writing or she is writing in. And what we have to try to translate is the energy of that event, the thing that happens to language. And that doesn't mean you can't do that by translating literally or by domesticating, because then you tend to use ready-made phrases all the time, how we say in English. Tolstoy never says anything in the way they say it in Russian. He always says it in the way Tolstoy says it in Russian. And there's always a mark on it. If you read the prose of Gerard Hopkins, for instance, he makes an enormous mark, a stamp. He places his stamp on English language. And any good writer does that. So what I try to be loyal to, literal to, or faithful to is that event in language that the original presents.
I just wanted to add, unless you're dying to say something now. No? Okay. I just wanted to add that I was translating a few years ago a book of Carlos Fuentes that was filled with Mexican street slang. And using Google and Urban Dictionary and various other things on the net, I was able to figure out roughly half of it, and the other half was incomprehensible. So I can't remember if I called him or emailed him or whatever, and I said, you have to help me with this because he said, I made it up. Edie, I made it up. I said, you made it up? He said, yeah, you make it up too. So that's what I did. You ride the train and you sit next to adolescent boys as close as you can get, and you hear how that language has to sound.
You heard it here first.
Something similar.
You ride next to adolescent boys. That's how great translations are made.
I didn't hear what you said.
No, I was saying that's the secret of translation, sitting next to adolescent boys in public spaces.
Something similar happens to us when we have to translate little sayings. Russian is full of proverbs and sayings that rhyme and are very playful. And occasionally we are able to find an equivalent in English. But sometimes we can't, and Richard just invents them, just makes them up, some jingle, something that rhymes, and we think it works. But I'm sure someone could accuse us of being literalists because we translate something that's ordinary in Russian with something that doesn't exist in English, so what are we?
There's a wonderful Spanish contemporary writer named Javier Marias, who some of you may know his work, novelist and essayist and journalist, and also translator. He began his life as a translator. He was the son of a philosopher who was one of the disciples of Ortega y Gasset, and at a very early age, Marias began translating great English works into Spanish. He translated Tristram Shandy, he translated Isak Dinesen, he translated Nabokov, Updike, Salinger, a whole range of things, Ashbery's poems. And he says that in order to be a writer, you need to have been a translator. And he says if he ever opened a writing school, and he never will, he said, he would make it a school of translation. But he says a translator is ultimately attempting to, much like a great actor, find a performable version in their own language of the original. So you are trying to, he says it's to rewrite a great writer is a great privilege, but it's also a great opportunity because you're rewriting a great book. You're not carefully, ministering to it so that it can be preserved in your language. It has to be reborn, and much like an actor would give it voice, you give it voice, is his metaphor.
It's interesting you say that. It just reminded me that Tolstoy's first attempt at writing was a translation of Lawrence Stern's Sentimental Journey.
Really?
Oh, wow, I didn't know that.
And Dostoevsky's first attempt was a translation of Eugénie Grandet, which he actually, at the age of 23, he published it and went around saying, it's better than the original. That's the modesty of young men.
Nabokov translated Alice in Wonderland into Russian, and it's said to be quite superb.
There are different opinions about that.
Well, there we are.
And he retold it. He made it seem as if it is a story of a Russian girl, Anya, and everything that happens her is adjusted to Russian realities of the time, and it's very, very far from Alice in Wonderland. In fact, it's his own creation, and it has not been very popular in Russia.
Oh, I'm shocked because Nabokov is famous for scolding translators to not being faithful enough to their originals.
That's why his Eugene Onegin is unreadable. It's unreadable. It's unfathomable. I managed to get through the first 20 lines, and I couldn't do any more.
Well, there are two Nabokov translators.
Right.
There's the Nabokov who translated when he was at Cambridge and when he was living in Europe before the war. And then there's the Nabokov who came to America, became an American writer, and had to teach these texts in colleges and discovered that these translators take such liberties. So Anya Strani Struges, I think, or how do you say his Alice in Wonderland?
Anya в стране чудес.
Чудес, yeah. Stranie Чудес, the Wonderland, literally.
Was done when he was 20. So he became the most inflexible person in the world. I had the chance to look at the Berg collection of the New York Public Library at all his teaching copies. And in his teaching copy of Swan's Way, after kind of nearly pornographic bursts in the margins for the first 40 or 50 pages, on page 59, he finally just writes, and you can see he broke his pencil when doing it, "This translator is insane!" Exclamation point, exclamation point. So, conservatism in us as we age is perhaps a truth. I don't know, but, he certainly became very conservative.
But he said when he revised his Eugene Onegin, he said, I revised the whole thing and made it much worse.
Oh dear. So the translation of Anna Karenina that you put up, Wyatt, was, I believe, the Constance Garnett, the opening. Happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, which I know that Richard and Larissa have retranslated. All happy families are alike. Each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, which has a nice snappiness to it. But I'm wondering, do you share Nabokov's opinion of Constance Garnett? For those of you who don't know, she, in the early 20th century was the one who sort of translated her way through Russian literature and brought us all these Russian writers we love in the first place, but there are a lot of opinions about her translations, and I'm curious if she was important to you, if you think she was not a strong translator?
I've gained an enormous respect for her the longer I've lived. Her translations generally are the best. That's not now the current wisdom, but when I look at various translations, hers is usually the most precise. And I should add that she translated 70 volumes of Russian literature. People think we've translated a lot. We've translated 20. So imagine how this woman worked. And the quality of the work, and I know she worked with other people. She had sources who did first drafts for her and things like that. But the quality, the constancy of it is quite remarkable. She, on the other hand, had a rather, she was not very humorous. And so that's what happened to Dostoevsky. All the humor got left out. She didn't translate it. The wordplay wasn't there. But, she translated War and Peace in 1905, and it's still in print. Yeah. People say, well, we need a new translation every generation or something like that, but her work has been in print for over 100 years.
I was always very grateful to her for having translated so much and allowed me to read Russian literature, which I never would have been able to do without her.
Yeah, I feel like my first kind of mature-ish experiences of narrative prose reading were her prose, as a teen reading those Russian novels, just finding that certainly wasn't thinking about issues of translation while doing so.
Exactly.
Right.
No, Dostoevsky was the least humorous. He was wonderful because there was not a smile to be found in any of Dostoevsky, which appealed to my teenage heart. I really responded to that.
There isn't any in Tolstoy, but Tolstoy is also very funny, sometimes very funny. Different kind of humor. He doesn't play with words, but he can be very, very sarcastic.
Tolstoy is also very precise, and I wanted to add to what Edith said about this loyalty both to the language and to the author. Sometimes you really have to choose because after all, the author is there, he's specific, you know him, you read his text, and the reader is hypothetical, there are all kinds of readers. Which one of them are you addressing? People have different reading experience. Some of them say, "Oh, I can't read that. That's terrible." Tolstoy sometimes wrote terrible prose. I have in front of me a text. I don't know whether I should read it in Russian. It's absolutely incredible. Психологические наблюдения о способности человека ретроспективно подделывать мгновенно под совершившийся факт целый ряд мнимо свободных умозаключений, in parentheses, это я намерен изложить в другом месте более подробно, close parentheses, подтверждает предположение о том, что сознание свободы человека при совершении известного рода поступков ошибочно. All right. So what do you do with that? Of course, it is quite possible to straighten it out and to say more or less.
Read the translation. This is from his little afterword called A Few Words Apropos of the book War and Peace. Psychological observations of man's ability to make an instantaneous retrospective adjustment of a whole series of allegedly free conjectures to an accomplished fact, I intend to set this forth in more detail elsewhere, confirm the assumption that man's consciousness of freedom in the committing of acts of a certain sort is mistaken. You got that?
Yes, and another little thing, with Tolstoy, for instance, he's such a great artist. What he does is like nothing anyone ever did. It's Tolstoyan. No one writes like him. And what do you do when it is really quite extraordinary, strange, incredible. For instance, in Anna Karenina, in the beginning, when Steve Oblonsky gets out of bed and puts on his dressing gown, он встал, надел серый халат на голубой шелковой подкладке, закинул кисти узлом и, вдоволь забрав воздуха в свой широкий грудной ящик, you know? It's like a great painter, just 3 strokes of a brush, and you see Steve Oblonsky, and if you translate it as he just took a deep breath, it's all lost. It's all lost. One translator would say that taking a deep breath of air into his broad chest. Someone else says drawing a full breath of air into his broad chest. Drawing a deep breath into his powerful lungs. What Tolstoy says is drawing a goodly amount of air into the broad box of his chest.
Oh, that's nice.
So,
Broad box.
are we literalists or who are we?
What do I think? I think where we have to be really loyal to the original is to make the translation as quirky as the original is. In other words, if it is immensely difficult, then the translation should be immensely difficult. Every reviewer in New York will say what a lousy translation it is because it's incomprehensible. But
And
you
it's
have to
your
ignore
fault.
the reviewers and do that. Conversely, if there is nothing difficult in the original, there should be nothing difficult in the translation. So you owe that, I think, to the original. And by the way, speaking of repeating words within a paragraph, even if you repeat everything, the copy editor will change it. So you will have to struggle with the publisher.
You have to put it all back.
To keep the repetitions if you think they're important.
Stet is this word.
I wonder if you would all speak a little bit about your process. I mean, actually, maybe Richard and Larissa will start because you two work together, and that must be a different sort of process. But I think it would be good for everyone to hear, how a translator does his or her work. If you're willing to share.
You're not leaving, are you?
You're first.
I prepare a first draft by hand, which is just my habit. I don't have any principles about using or not using computers. I just write with a pencil the first draft, in which I try to be as close to the original as possible. Trying to reproduce more, as far as possible, the syntax and the quirkiness, if there is any, and I indicate whether it's a cliche or a cliche that is slightly distorted, if there is some hidden quotation or reference to something, to the scriptures or whatever, and I give that to Richard, and then his sufferings begin.
Yes, I work with that and with the original and often with other translations. I find that without any principle that I tend to look at the translations after I translate, and just to see. Sometimes, mostly, I'm very pleased with what we've done, so I don't borrow from them. There's a famous, well-known scholar at Yale, Robert Louis Jackson. When we first began translating, he said, "Look at the others, and if they do something good, steal it." Once in a while, I do, but mostly, I check it just to see I'm not getting too far away. But I've learned a lot of Russian over the years, and I follow the original very carefully. I try to get the sounds, the rhythms, the word order. For instance, Russian uses inversions quite a lot more because it syntactically can put the verb anywhere it likes. sometimes the placement of the verb is very important for the force of the sentence, and I will risk using an inversion, although again the copy editors will say, oh, that's an inversion. I say yes. Sometimes the Russian uses the passive voice much more than English. English, for some reason, has a rule that you should always use the active voice. But I very often use the passive voice in the way the Russian does. It makes it sort of impersonal, roundabout way of getting at something, which I think is important. But so we make a second version, which then goes back to Larissa, who takes the original, goes over it. And I also mark my version all up with my questions, my doubts. I underline things. I put arrows. Is this a repetition? Why is this here? And she takes my marked up version, she goes over it, writes her responses, and then we get together and we go over that together, making what we call final decisions. Then I type out a new version, clean, and then I read it out loud while Larissa follows in the Russian. We make further changes, and we finally send that to the publisher. But then it goes through at least 2 sets of proofs. And we, again, in proofs, we read it aloud against the original, just to keep checking.
How many hours a day would you say that you spend translating, you two?
Hours a day?
Yeah.
6, maybe. 6.
We used to work much longer hours. We used to work 8, sometimes even in the evening, 10 hours.
Yeah.
6 sounds like a lot to me, actually.
But not
To be
anymore.
writing.
No, I can't.
We had deadlines.
Oh, there's that, yeah.
Oh, they're not so dead.
But we used to... No, we used to dismay our publishers by meeting our deadlines, because they never expect you. They think we'll have another year after that. And we would send everything in just on time, and they say, oh, God, now we have to publish this.
Yes, yes. Edie, would you talk about your revision process and your drafting and how you work?
It's not too dissimilar from what Larissa and Richard do, except there's only one of me. So I do a rough draft. I am of the generation, I shouldn't blame it on my generation. I need a printout as soon as possible. I need hard copy as soon as I can, because I don't read on the screen the way I read from a page. So I do a rough draft, a very rough draft. Sometimes if I can't find a word, if it's a word I don't know and I can't find it right away, I just leave it in Spanish. I don't bother to look it up or anything like that. And then I revise that. It's very rough and it needs a huge amount of editing. And I start to do the editing, and at some point at the second revision, perhaps third revision, I do an accuracy check against the original to make sure that I haven't jumped off a cliff, that the English, in fact, reflects the original. And then I put the Spanish away, and I edit the English, and I fix it and fix it and fix it so that it reads the way I want it to read, or as close to that as I can get. I read aloud a lot. As I tell my students constantly that your eye forgives everything and your ear forgives nothing. And if you have any doubts about what you've written, you have to read it out loud and hear what it sounds like. And then, you know, you could spend the rest of your life revising, except there is a due date and you have to turn it in. But then you have a chance, as you said. There's you got the copy editor's version back, and you can check on that. And then there's a first pass and a second pass. So you have 2 sets of galleys, 2 sets of proofs. And of course, I see that more clearly than I see anything typed, because it's the printed page.
Yeah.
And I read that. My brain processes it differently from any other kind of reading.
Right.
This is why you want to ask translators any questions you have about a book, because the translator is someone who has read the book 10 times recently, and really has it present. Now, Wyatt, you're a very active literary critic as well as translator. How do you get the critic to shut up when you're translating?
By translating less, essentially. I would say that in coming to writing literary criticism, there's no better training than translation, because it forces you to weigh the weight of the words that you're reading. And there's an assumption when reading something new that it has to pass our test. That is to say, oh, what do we think of this new writer? More often I find that it's a matter of, we tend to fail the test, which is to say we judge a new book on the basis of our unfamiliarity with it, just as a translator would be intimately familiar with the text and could judge it by contrast. So, if you don't read a book twice that's unheard of to you, then you haven't read it once as a critic, because it's going to be too foreign to you. That second read is you've done essentially the intellectual work of imposing this new writer's syntax on your brain, and you've had it in there, and then you can actually read it once you can actually recognize the moves a writer makes and evaluate them and all that. So I think that the process of having to read word by word, line by line, and build meaning in that way is rich study for anybody who might want to write about literature. But I wouldn't say that the critic has to be quiet when translating, because I would say translation is also an act of scholarship and criticism at all times. And my early drafts are always investigative. If I'm working, as I've mostly worked on 19th century French poetry, doing the translations of Arthur Rimbaud, you can now on the internet go to Artful, the University of Chicago site, ARTFL, which has a dictionary which is a combination of 8 different French dictionaries from 1606 to 1932, including the Émile Lettré of 1872. And you can just feast on etymology, usage in the French, and then go to the Oxford historical thesaurus and look up all the words that nobody uses anymore that actually are the exact translations of the French words, but you can't use because totally obsolete. The point being that there's a lot of criticism or scholarship or just simply thinking that you get to do about language if you're translating or writing criticism. I think they're kindred rather than opposed.
I'm about to open up the floor to questions, so. Oh, there are some already. Okay, well, and then I'll do that then. Third row. I wonder, do we have a microphone that could travel around? Is this, no, this doesn't look travelable. There's no house mic, or is there? Someone's marching down the aisle. Would you like to come up and say your question? So, because I think people would like to hear you while we're waiting for the house mic to arrive. Thank you.
Tom Hartman. I'm a member of the Harriman Institute here for Russian Studies Translation. I'm wondering if you can say something about the untranslatability of poetry. I'm thinking in particularly of Pushkin.
It's the Pushkin question. It was inevitable.
You're right, it's untranslatable. We have avoided doing it because of that. Well, not only because of that, but Pushkin is so perfect that anything you try to do with it turns out to be so lame in comparison that it's so disappointing to try to do it that we haven't done it. I suppose that someone with the... And another problem is you might be able to do a short poem with the right, just by luck it would come to you. But to do a lot becomes a plodding kind of work, and you can't be inspired all the time. You can't be lucky all the time. So we haven't done it. But Pushkin is... if we had a nice, good, heavy Baroque writer, that would be much easier. rhetoric is easy, but poetry is difficult.
Russian also seems to have more rhymes than English, and Russian syntax is so free. You know, this Pushkin's poetry is so free, and anything that either you just retell it as Nabokov did,
Tried to do.
No, it's not quite a retell. There is some vestiges of poetry in his translation, I think. But either you just retell it in prose, or when you start to put it into this same form Pushkin used, you inevitably add something or delete something, and somehow it is always it's always disappointing.
I see ample microphones floating around. In front, there's a question.
There's a mic on its way to you.
What is the relation, if any, between retranslating a classic and a pianist sitting down to perform Moonlight Sonata in 2014?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Understand.
I couldn't hear you
I think
clearly.
that oh, yeah.
What is the relation, if any, between retranslating a classic and a pianist sitting down to perform Moonlight Sonata in 2014?
There's a very close relationship, I think, because translators are performers. And we interpret an original very much the way a musician interprets, a player interprets a composition.
Yes, I agree. Yeah.
You know, somebody, it was Ralph Mannheim, translator from German, who said, a translator is like an actor who speaks the author's lines the way the author would if the author could speak English. And which I have taken to my heart as a kind of a, what do you call it, a motto, a slogan, a mantra. And so I do think translation is a type of performance. And so it may not be all that different from playing the Moonlight Sonata or any other did you choose Beethoven because he's lived a long time ago?
And also because it's a classic which is performed so many times.
Right.
Yeah.
It is now an active interpretation among the interpretations.
I mean, you might extend that excellent metaphor and say it's transposing the Moonlight Sonata from piano to tuba. You know, it's depending upon your instrument.
Could we say harmonica or something?
Let's say harmonica.
I'm going to tweet that.
Yes, I was thinking of that. We've been working on plays recently with Richard Nelson, a wonderful playwright, and it began to appear to me that even translating prose is a kind of performance, the way a director and an actor has to interpret a role, that there is no final interpretation, there is no final translation. You can always change it. You can tip it one way or another way. It's even interesting that we worked on the cherry orchard, and depending on how you understand the character like Lopakhin, the man who finally buys the cherry orchard, you translate his lines slightly differently, and it's puzzling because Chekhov wrote them in one way. He wrote this, but our translations are different depending on how we think we want, how we understand the character, which means that this is a performance. Someone else will read it another way, and therefore translate it another way. That makes everything kind of wishy-washy, I know.
Well, Beckett once said, next time I'll have to fail better.
Yeah.
And which is what everybody does who attempts to do anything, whether it's translation or anything else. You always know that you have failed. And next time you'll have to fail better.
That's why stealing from other translators is actually a moral act. And so, when I translated The Drunken Boat, Rimbaud's poem, I felt totally free to read Samuel Beckett's one translation of Rimbaud, of The Drunken Boat, and take the best lines. I credit him, but by the same token, it seems cruel not to take a better writer's work in that instance.
That's an
Carry
interesting
it forward, as it were.
I'll have to use it next time.
Okay, we've got one over here, and then we'll go to this side. Yes, you.
We talked a lot about the literary aspects of translating literary classics. There's also, it strikes me, a political aspect to it, because this is one of the ways you draw attention to a writer whose reputation may have slipped or may have been forgotten. And I wonder if you guys can comment on that a little bit.
Well, certainly in the 80s, the American writer Philip Roth spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and made it an imperative to bring over the work of writers because he had an imprint at the time. And so that was certainly both an aesthetic and a political act, is a first thought.
Well, one of the things I can say is that I don't choose what I translate. The publisher chooses what I translate because I translate for a living. So there needs to be a business arrangement going on between the publisher and myself. And unfortunately, for most publishers, any language other than Spanish or French is exotic. And you hardly have any editors at all in New York who read Spanish, let alone French, let alone German or Russian. So I think there's a whole lot of politics in the publishing business, but I'm just a lackey, I just work for them, and I don't choose what I translate. Perhaps I shouldn't confess that.
We do choose what we translate. In fact, we've chosen all of the books except one. We were asked to translate Dr. Zhivago, but the rest of them we offered to publishers, and luckily they took them.
Luck.
But
Pure luck.
because we had done quite a lot of work, we were recently able to publish a large collection of stories by Nikolai Leskov, a very great writer of the same period as Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, who is almost forgotten in the West, or almost unknown in the West. There's been one collection by David Magarshak that keeps moving from one publisher to another. It goes out of print with one, comes back into print, but it's always the same 5 stories, or 6. So I guess you could call that political, that we tried to. Leskov had a hard time himself politically because he was cast very early in his life as a reactionary, which he wasn't at all. And that stuck to him all the time. He couldn't publish in certain magazines. They said, "Oh, you mean this reactionary Leskov?" And he couldn't get away from that until the very end of his life. But there's a peculiar thing. We were finally able to do this big collection. We got some very good reviews, but since he's unknown, he remains unknown. It doesn't sell very well. It's selling rather well, but nothing compared to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Why everybody wants them because they already have them. But it's very hard to do something that isn't known. Mm-hmm. I mean, Quixote we know, but Góngora.
Well, books of poetry, if you sell 2,000 copies in the United States, even not a translation, poetry written originally in English, you have a bestseller on your hands. That's a lot of books for a book of poetry. Yeah. A translation of a poet who lived 400 years ago, but it did. It made it to 2,000. It's roughly about 2,000, maybe 2,500 copies that were sold, which I.
Do you think that's because of your name or Góngora?
It has to be Góngora.
Yeah, okay.
Modestly.
I'm going to say it's a combination. I think at a certain point, translators who become really well-known are in a position to use their names to help promote authors who are not as well-known at that point.
Yeah, but that's only if the publisher will put your name on the cover.
Yes.
Oh, that's a whole other
Otherwise, it's
question.
useless.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it doesn't always work. For instance, we once upon a time put together a collection of Dostoevsky's short works, and instead of saying great short works of Dostoevsky, we entitled it by the one of the stories, the short novel, The Eternal Husband, which is thinking that we're going to introduce this forgotten work by Dostoevsky, The Eternal Husband, a wonderful, wonderful short novel, doesn't sell at all. Doesn't sell at all. People don't know what's that, The Eternal Husband. Although the rest of the collection is just like any other collection, just short works, great short works. You know, the others sell like hotcakes, and ours doesn't.
So go and buy it.
Let's take that question over here.
I've really enjoyed the panel, and I wanted to ask you a question about people who have published their own original work as translations. Think about Montaigne, who was in France and was not being taken seriously because he was a Russian and he was writing in French, so he started publishing his work as translations. And other cases, sometimes in oppressive regimes, people publish their work as translations when it's really their own work. And so I'm wondering, is translation both sort of a realm of freedom and a realm of authority and legitimacy? Just curious of your thoughts.
Anyone want to take that one?
I'd have to think more about it.
Yes,
Yeah,
I've never.
it's a very interesting question. In a way, your question is already the answer. You know, it's a really interesting realm of in between space. You know, for identity. You know, it used to go the other way around. I know in Germany in the late 18th, early 19th centuries, women were translating a lot and publishing under men's names. You know, because it was not, you know, allowed to enter into, you know, the public sphere and print that way. As for, you know, their own original writings, you know, that's. But these are all sort of interesting side areas around translation. But are you writing about this? I'd like to read it. Please do. Okay, other questions?
I actually have a
okay,
thought. If we extend politics to an idea of, you know, the place of the self and the voice of a self within a culture, if that's an admissible idea for that subject, I'd say the example of Beckett choosing to write in French to avoid the influence of his former boss, James Joyce, because when Beckett started writing in English in a novel called A Dream of Fair to Middling Women, which was only published later, we now know why, because it reads like, you know, the most Joycean thing you've ever read. And he started writing in French so that he would write in a language that he knew very well, but he had a different kind of command over. And then when he translated it back into English, it was him, as opposed to, you know, so that's a kind of political path to the self, if you look at it that way.
There is a
maybe.
collection of Russian poems, Russian children's poems, called Glupaya Loshad, a silly horse, and it has a Russian author who passed it off as a translation from English because he thought otherwise he would never be able to publish it.
But we looked for the originals and they don't exist.
Yeah, and in fact, I translate a Japanese writer named Yoko Tawada who writes in Japanese and writes in German. And it used to be she would write some books in one language and some books in the other language. And she's taken now to making dual versions, which is a publishing nightmare, but completely wonderful. So she'll start writing a novel. You know, the first chapter comes out in German, the second chapter comes out in Japanese, and so forth. And then she makes two versions, so there are two competing originals, which are quite different from one another. floating around. Which one gets translated into English? You know, no publisher is going to translate them both into English. And her latest novel, she wrote originally in Japanese and then for the first time ever translated it herself into German, and it's set in Europe. And she's telling us now that she wants us to translate her German version and not the Japanese original, even though that was the original, because she says, well, I've already brought it into a Western language for you. It's got more me in it than if you were to translate it from Japanese. And that's a really interesting sort of take on authorial, well, on authority, in fact, in that sense. Questions? Okay, you're in front.
Yes, could you say something about Wyatt, you started to address this, the scholarship that goes into making the decisions that you make as translators? There is obviously a lot written about Montaigne, you know, sentence stands alone, no word stands alone.
Right.
How do you figure out the context that you need in order to make the complicated decisions that you need to make about language? Thank you.
It's easier if we were to take a specific sentence to suggest what I want to say, but I think that context, you know, much like the historical moment or the political moment in which a text might have been written, the context is most richly provided for, from my standpoint, through researching the meaning of the word at that time and its etymology and its usage by other writers. The idea that that one could go beyond the words to find some sort of understanding of the coherence of a particular work is something that's foreign to me also as a critic. I really like to hold to a sentence and try to figure out what the sentence does and then how it functions within a paragraph and all of that. So from a very functional standpoint, and when I teach a seminar in translation, I'm teaching one right now in Rimbaud's Illuminations, you know, the students build their own dictionaries, soup to nuts of every word that they don't know in the Illuminations, even if they're bilingual and think they know all the words. And through that kind of, that submission to the idea that there is information out there that is very specific kind of spares you the idea of having to interpret too much too soon. I mean, when you're really at the end and you're really reading, you know, the 19th draft, there's time to think about context because then you're actually understanding what you're reading. And I'm not suggesting that, you know, when I was living in France, there was a horrible person who said to me, Proust, il faut lire minimum 10 fois, minimum. You must read Proust a minimum of 10 times, and that's, you know, great if you do nothing else. But translators do read that much, their own, you know, versions, and so context. Did that touch upon that at all? Yeah. Okay.
Well, sometimes if you're translating a classic, say Quixote, the Spanish edition is jammed with footnotes to explain every reference and every allusion because, that contemporary people simply don't know. So I acknowledge the work of the editor of the Spanish edition that I used. Martín de Riquer was the editor. And his footnotes were wonderful. And he would have comparisons, words that were difficult, and he would indicate how the French, English, and Italian translations rendered that word. So it was, I mean, his footnotes were brilliant. For Góngora, there's Damaso Alonso, who did a prose translation of the poem because it's so difficult and complex that Spanish speakers don't read it for the most part. But
so he wrote it in prose in Spanish?
It was in Spanish, yeah.
Yeah.
This was a prose explication and translation of the poem, and I relied very heavily on that. So that's some of the scholarship. It's kind of, for me, it's secondhand scholarship.
Yeah, same for me. I look at all kinds of notes. I look at I read books. Some books. About Dostoevsky, there are thousands of them, so I haven't read them all, but it's important. And there are, of course, these critical editions with good commentaries. Yes?
On the subject of notes, I'd be curious to hear from Annie or all of you about how you feel about footnoting your own translations. Where do you note? Where is it that a note would just be intrusive? How much do you rely? I know that Richard has made a whole genre out of footnotes. But I'm curious, it's a very, it makes a lot of difference how you translate if you know that you can have something outside of the text to explain.
I hate footnotes. I mean, I love them when I'm reading them, but I don't like using them in my own translations. But I did put footnotes into the Quixote for some of the reason that I mentioned before. There are historical references, geographical references in the book that were perfectly obvious to a Spanish reader in the 17th century, and they are not perfectly obvious to an American reader in the 21st century. And so I felt obliged to give that information. And if you are going to use notes, I like footnotes and not endnotes so that you don't have to turn pages to get the information. I used footnotes for the 16th and 17th century poetry that I've translated for essentially the same reason. And for Góngora, some of the imagery is so dense that I explicated it in a footnote just so the English language reader could read through it. The only contemporary book where I used footnotes, and I used them very sparingly, was in Garcia Marquez's memoir, Living to Tell the Tale, where he makes reference to Colombian politics in the 1940s and the 1950s, and Colombians surely would know it, but North Americans would not, and so I footnoted certain of those things. Otherwise, I really stay far away from them.
The one distinction I'd draw is, I guess, if you're preparing an edition of a work that's been translated many times, there may be an established critical edition which offers an enormous amount of scholarship that it would just be inappropriate to draw upon. And it's not a competing work in that way, it's supplemental. So in the case of doing a translation of Rimbaud or Montaigne, I'd want to put in anything historical that an American reader would have difficulty finding an answer to easily. But I think that readers should be left to find the answers themselves when it's, a word they don't know or whatever it is of that order.
Yeah, as has been mentioned, I like the form of the footnote or the end note. I prefer end notes. My favorite way would be to have no numbers and just have end notes for people curious enough to say, what the hell is that? And they look in the back and they find the explanation. Sometimes publishers do that. But there is a problem of knowing when to stop. I mean, when I mention Jesus Christ, I hope that people know who he is. But I'm not sure anymore. So I don't know at what point we assume a general culture and at what point we have to explain it. And it apparently is changing. But I try to footnote what I think is essential and that the average reader wouldn't know without being told. But in Russian things, there are a lot of local references, topical references to things that as soon as you mention the name, Russians all react in a certain way, but Americans don't. So, I try to explain things that an American reader wouldn't know offhand.
There are also notes that are simply, it's fun to research and to give them to readers. Like in War and Peace, there are about 200 generals, young generals who went to war. And
French and Russian.
They're French and Russian, and they're all historical. And each note is a potential novel. You know, they're amazing people. So we enjoyed researching.
The best footnote I ever saw was in an Italian edition of the Divine Comedy, and the footnote said, "Questo è il verso più bello della lingua italiana." This is the most beautiful line in Italian. And I thought, what? I had to move my eye down to the bottom of the page to read that. So one day I would love to do a footnote like that and see if anybody notices.
Just couldn't help himself.
I guess not.
Other questions? We'll take this one over here. I'm trying to honor both sides of the room. It's a challenge.
Thank you, guys. For Richard and Larissa, I'm curious about the choice, at least up till now, not to translate Turgenev. And that comes from just my admiration for your other work, and I love Turgenev.
How curious that you asked that. When we met before, I was asked the same question. We did translate Turgenev's play, A Month in the Country, which is going to be published sometime this year. But there are too many writers. We weren't that interested in Turgenev's work. I thought that I didn't like it as much as the others, but Larissa tells me I'm mistaken. Because she began reading it and said,
couldn't stop.
He's really good. But we haven't just had time to do it. And we're thinking about that.
Next up. Okay, in front here.
So I teach Lit Hum, but I also teach Latin. And as a reader and a lover, and especially a teacher of another language from which many things are translated, I feel the party line I often have to toe is that it's better in the original, or one can only appreciate it truly in the original. I imagine all of you have the same sort of relationship with the languages you translate from. And yet as translators, you have clearly also made peace with the idea that it is possible to relate to a work in translation. I wonder how you reconcile those two ideas.
Never. I never reconcile.
No.
It's an ongoing problem.
You
And I
just
don't
forget
think
it.
Pardon me?
You just forget about it if you're doing the work.
No, there can be two opinions. You can translate anything, like Paul Schmidt used to say, that everything can be translated. And then you can say nothing could be translated. So once you say these two things, you start translating.
And it's a luxury to have the choice to read a translation of the original. You know, most of us don't have that luxury in most languages.
At Bard, we have a similar thing to the core course, which is called First Year Seminar. And the first term is taught, it's all translations. And when Dante was included, it was really hard going for the students because there is so much historical reference and there is so much loss of poetry that's inevitable. And so that can be an instance where I think it's profitable to be upfront and to try to say, not all translations are equal because not all poets are doing things that are communicable. And whereas, Lucretius in the translations that we teach he comes through superbly. So given that a lot of these books in that kind of survey course are taught to be able to have a conversation about the ideas that the writers are grappling with that are often quite similar from generation to generation or era to era, I find that the translations are more than adequate to begin that conversation. And the other thing to do is, that I do is, when teaching, say, the Old Testament, it's fun to bring in, 4 different translations of Genesis 3 and use BibleGateway.com, which, if you don't know it, is the best site on the internet, even better than Hulu. You can read every Bible, every translation in the universe on that site and compare different ones. And so you can do a modern evangelical translation like The Voice against the King James, and it's a fun Friday night.
What do you do in your spare time?
Spare time?
Yeah, we need a translation of that concept. Speaking of time, we seem to have run over our allotted time, so I would say that if you have questions that you didn't get answered, that you just kind of mob us and come ask your question, because otherwise, especially mob the other end of the table. But I don't want to keep those of you who need to go somewhere, but thank you so much for coming out and bringing such great questions and bearing with us for these long 2 hours. And thank you to the wonderful panelists who traveled here and did a wonderful job telling us stories.